The first gunshot did not sound like panic. It sounded like a decision. At 2:14 a.m., a single round punched through the reinforced glass of the Langford estate's ground floor, shattering a wall that had been designed to withstand storms, not intent. The sound traveled outward, sharp and final, slicing through the quiet suburb and into the dark industrial stretch beyond it. For half a second, the city hesitated. Then the night obeyed. Security cameras embedded along the perimeter stuttered. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in sequence, each repeating the same fragment of footage before freezing. The monitoring software logged the interruption as a minor transmission error and archived it automatically. No alert escalated. No technician reviewed the feed. The system did exactly what it had been prepared to do. The Langford house stood where the city stopped pretending to be civilized. To the north, renovated townhouses and curated parks promised order, safety, and the illusion of permanence. To the south, warehouses, rail spurs, and forgotten factories exhaled rust and chemical residue into the night. The estate had been built decades earlier, when money still believed it could anchor itself between worlds and survive both. Concrete instead of stone, glass instead of ornament. Reinforced lines, low profile, no excess. A house designed not to impress, but to endure. That night, endurance was irrelevant. Gunfire followed the first shot in controlled succession. Not frantic bursts, not the sound of fear, but a measured progression through space. The shooters moved with intent, clearing rooms in an order that suggested preparation rather than reaction. Doors were breached only when necessary. Corners were taken cleanly. The goal was not intimidation, it was completion. Nothing was being searched for. Nothing was being taken. This was removal. On the second floor, Evelyn Langford stood barefoot on cold stone, her body suspended between disbelief and instinct. She had returned home late, long after the family stopped performing togetherness. Her room sat at the edge of the house's internal geography, distant from the study, the dining room, the spaces where decisions had always been made without her. She had been scrolling through her phone, half aware, when the sound reached her. One sharp crack, then another. Then a pattern that refused to disguise itself as coincidence. She recognized the difference immediately. This was not noise. This was procedure. The smell reached her before the screams ever did. Smoke crept upward through the ventilation shafts, carrying a sharp, chemical edge that did not belong to an accident. Fire had been introduced deliberately, not as chaos, but as insurance. Evelyn's chest tightened, not with fear yet, but with recognition. The house had taught her this language long before tonight. It had taught her how danger announced itself quietly. She moved before her mind caught up. She did not run toward her parents. She did not call out. The absence of hesitation felt like betrayal even as it kept her alive. She slipped into the narrow emergency stairwell the architect had insisted on including years earlier, dismissed by the family as excessive. Her hand shook against the rail as she descended, counting steps, counting breaths, listening to unfamiliar voices below. They were low, controlled, unhurried. The voices did not belong in the house. By the time she reached the ground floor, smoke had thickened, turning familiar corridors into distorted tunnels. Light fractured through the haze, shadows stretching and collapsing as fire found its path. Evelyn caught glimpses she would later try and fail to forget. Her father near the study doorway, his body positioned as if he had tried to stand and been interrupted mid-thought. Her mother farther back, closer to the kitchen, the angle of her fall suggesting movement, not confrontation. Blood soaked into surfaces that had once been polished for guests, who never stayed long enough to notice the tension beneath them. Evelyn stepped backward, her heels slipping, her shoulder striking the wall. The house felt wrong then, not violated, emptied, as if something essential had been extracted with surgical precision. Fire alarms finally activated, their shrill cry arriving too late to matter. Sprinklers remained silent. Another safeguard disabled long before tonight. Smoke rolled along the ceiling, thick and intentional, forcing movement in specific directions. Evelyn followed the layout she knew better than most, slipping into the service corridor that had always existed for staff rather than family. Her fingers fumbled with the emergency override, numb with cold and adrenaline, until the door gave way. Night air hit her like impact. Outside, the estate looked smaller, less permanent. Flames reflected off the glass, warping the house's sharp geometry into something fragile and temporary. She ran without direction, skin tearing on gravel, lungs burning as much from smoke as from panic. Behind her, the house roared as fire took control, glass shattering under pressure, concrete cracking as heat finally claimed what bullets had not. No one chased her. That absence lodged itself deep, even then. Sirens arrived long after the outcome was sealed. Police vehicles lined the road, lights washing the scene in artificial urgency. Fire crews moved with grim efficiency, already aware they were documenting aftermath, not rescue. The night filled with uniforms, radios, procedures designed to impose order on something already finished. Evelyn collapsed near the road, her hands slick with blood that was not entirely her own. A blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Someone spoke, then someone else. Questions came fast and practiced. She did not answer. Her body shook, not from cold, but from the delayed understanding that survival had not been part of the plan. By dawn, the story had already begun forming without her. Authorities spoke of a targeted incident, possibly related to financial disputes. Media avoided words that implied intent. They spoke of malfunctions, security failures, unfortunate timing. No one explained why nothing was missing. No one asked how a house built to resist intrusion had fallen in minutes. From a hospital bed, staring at a ceiling identical to every other ceiling she had never belonged under, Evelyn Langford understood something with devastating clarity. This had not been about theft. It had not been about revenge. It had been about erasure. The Langfords had held something they were not meant to keep. The house had been designed to outlast pressure. Instead, it had been reduced to evidence. As the city woke and pretended nothing had shifted, Evelyn became the sole remaining variable in a calculation someone else believed complete. The house had been meant to disappear. She had not. The city did not wait for Evelyn Langford to catch up with what had happened to her. By the time she was discharged from the hospital, the machinery had already begun to move. Press releases were drafted. Statements were aligned. The tragedy of the Langford estate was being folded neatly into the city's ongoing narrative of controlled instability, framed as an isolated incident rather than a rupture. The language was careful, bloodless. No one spoke of execution. No one spoke of erasure. The event was described as unfortunate, complex, under investigation. Evelyn stepped back into the world carrying nothing but a borrowed coat, a phone with a cracked screen, and a name that was rapidly losing its weight. The first place she went was not the police. She understood instinctively that law enforcement operated downstream from decisions already made. Instead, she went to those who had once treated the Langfords as indispensable. Old partners, financial intermediaries, legal firms whose offices were wrapped in glass and discretion, people who had shaken her father's hand and dined at their table while carefully avoiding anything resembling loyalty. The doors did not slam in her face. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, they opened just enough to let cold air through. Receptionists offered sympathy without commitment. Assistants promised callbacks that never came. Meetings were postponed indefinitely, then quietly canceled. When she did manage to sit across from someone who recognized her face, the tone shifted immediately. Their posture changed. Their eyes measured risk rather than grief. Conversations ended quickly, redirected toward insurance claims, probate procedures, and jurisdictional limits. Without documents, she was a story. Without proof, she was an inconvenience. Without protection, she was invisible. The agreements her family had relied on were suddenly vague. Oral understandings did not survive public scrutiny. Old favors dissolved under legal language that emphasized compliance over obligation. Evelyn learned quickly that American power did not announce its refusal loudly. It buried it under procedure. Within days, the narrative evolved again. A name surfaced. Another woman appeared in public filings as the sole surviving heir to the Langford estate. Her name moved through the system with unsettling speed, attached to notarized documents, verified signatures, and a legal team that spoke with confidence rather than urgency. She was presented as composed, cooperative, grieving in a way that aligned neatly with expectations. She gave statements. She thanked authorities. She expressed trust in the process. The city accepted her without resistance. Evelyn watched from the margins as her own identity was absorbed and repurposed. The woman resembled her just enough to discourage immediate doubt, shared the family name convincingly, and carried herself with the practiced ease of someone who knew she would not be challenged. Photographs circulated. Headlines followed. The Langford name began attaching itself to a face that was not hers. It was not a theft. It was a replacement. When Evelyn attempted to intervene, the response was immediate and clinical. Without identification recovered from the fire, without witnesses willing to speak, without documents that had not conveniently vanished in the blaze, she was treated as an anomaly rather than a claimant. A potential complication. A liability. She was advised, gently and firmly, to step back. People she had known for years stopped answering messages. Others replied once, carefully, before disengaging completely. Some expressed concern for her well-being, suggesting rest, counseling, distance from stress. The implication was clear. Her insistence was beginning to look unstable. The city had no use for a second Langford. Financial access evaporated next. Accounts were frozen pending verification. Credit lines were suspended. Properties were sealed under legal review, now overseen by representatives who answered to someone else entirely. Evelyn's name triggered holds and delays rather than authority. She began to understand how quickly a person could be reduced to an administrative problem. And yet, she was not removed completely. That was the detail that refused to align. If she were truly a threat, she would have been erased as thoroughly as the house. Instead, she was pushed to the edges, stripped of leverage but kept close enough to observe. She was offered temporary accommodation under the guise of protection, positioned within reach of those managing the estate's transition. A compromise framed as assistance. It was humiliation disguised as mercy. Evelyn accepted it because she had no alternative. She moved through spaces that once would have been denied to her entirely, not as an owner but as an observer. She listened. She watched patterns emerge. The replacement heir's access was smooth, unchallenged. Decisions were made around her presence as if it were natural, too natural. The documents moved too fast. The approvals came too easily. Someone had prepared this. The realization settled slowly, dangerously. The woman who had taken her name was not improvising. She was executing a role designed long before the night of the fire. The paperwork had existed in waiting. The legal strategy had been rehearsed. The support network had been positioned deliberately. And Evelyn had been left alive not out of oversight, but because her survival served a purpose. She began to sense it in the way certain people watched her, not with hostility, but with assessment. As if her reactions mattered, as if her persistence or withdrawal would influence the next phase of something already in motion. She was not being ignored. She was being studied. In the absence of official recognition, Evelyn learned to operate quietly. She stopped pushing against closed doors and started paying attention to how they closed. She tracked which firms aligned themselves with the new heir, which city officials offered expedited cooperation, which security contractors replaced those that had failed the night of the attack. Patterns formed where explanations did not. The humiliation of her position became a tool. People underestimated her because she no longer occupied a defined role. Without a title, without authority, without resources, she was dismissed as background noise. That invisibility allowed her to move through the city without triggering defenses. She was no longer Evelyn Langford, heir to a financial dynasty. She was a woman without a name, watching her own history rewritten in real time. And beneath the exhaustion, beneath the grief she had not yet allowed herself to process, a colder understanding took root. This was not simply about replacing her. It was about controlling the aftermath, about ensuring the Langford legacy transformed into something manageable, something cooperative, something that would not resist being reshaped. The plan had accounted for documents, for lawyers, for public perception. It had not accounted for memory. Evelyn held what no one else could replicate: the rhythms of the house, the silences between conversations, the things her parents had stopped saying out loud near the end, the subtle fear that had crept into their routines long before the fire. She remained because she had been allowed to remain. And that meant the story was not finished with her yet. The mansion no longer belonged to the Langfords. Not in any way that mattered. From the outside, nothing had changed. The gates were restored, the facade cleaned of smoke and forensic markings, the lawn trimmed back into disciplined symmetry. At night, the building glowed again, warm and expensive, a visual reassurance to the surrounding elite neighborhood that order had been preserved. For passers-by, it was proof that the city had absorbed the shock and moved on. Inside, the house had become something else entirely. Evelyn felt it the moment she crossed the threshold again. The air was different, heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. The familiar creak of the staircase had been silenced. Rugs had been replaced. Furniture subtly repositioned. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic, but enough to disrupt memory. The house no longer responded to her movements. It resisted recognition. Cameras were everywhere. Some were visible, mounted openly in corners, embedded into sleek black fixtures that blended into modern design. Others were hidden, their presence betrayed only by faint mechanical hums and occasional reflections in glass. Evelyn learned quickly that there were no blind spots left by accident. Hallways, stairwells, exterior doors, even transitional spaces like foyers and galleries were covered from multiple angles. Privacy had been reclassified as a risk. She was allowed to stay under the official explanation of protection. The narrative framed it as a temporary measure, a responsible decision to ensure her safety while investigations continued. In practice, it placed her at the center of a controlled environment where every movement could be documented, interpreted, and archived. She was not a guest. She was not a prisoner. She was an asset under observation. The staff had changed almost entirely. The few remaining employees who had served the Langfords for years moved differently now, careful and restrained, their eyes avoiding Evelyn, for just a fraction of a second too long. New personnel rotated through the house with professional detachment, their loyalty clearly external. Security contractors answered to municipal channels rather than private management. Their presence was constant but never intrusive enough to provoke complaint. Power in this city did not need to announce itself loudly. It demonstrated control by eliminating the need for force. Evelyn adapted because she had to. She learned which rooms felt watched more intensely. She noticed how certain corridors triggered subtle shifts in camera angles, how lighting changed automatically to reduce shadow. She moderated her routines, varied her paths through the house, avoided patterns that could be easily profiled. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was an interface. Through careful observation, she began to understand how influence flowed through the space. Meetings took place in designated rooms, always within line of sight of multiple recording devices. Decisions were made quietly, supported by contracts and memoranda rather than raised voices. When pressure was applied, it came through delays, approvals withheld, access restricted. Violence had already done its work. Now came consolidation. The replacement heir appeared regularly, accompanied by advisors, legal representatives, and city-approved consultants. She moved through the house with a confidence that bordered on ownership, speaking with ease to people who deferred to her authority. Her presence triggered a recalibration of space, doors opening more readily, staff responding faster. Evelyn remained close enough to witness it. That, too, was intentional. The man entered the story without ceremony. He did not arrive surrounded by spectacle or armed escorts. When he first walked into the mansion, it was almost unnoticed, announced only by a subtle shift in posture among the security staff and a quiet realignment of attention. He was a figure whose authority did not require emphasis. He was the city's executive power. Whether titled mayor, governor, or administrator mattered less than his function. He represented the convergence of political control and economic influence, a leader praised publicly for efficiency and decisiveness, criticized privately for methods that produced results too quickly to question. His reputation preceded him, but his demeanor contradicted expectation. He did not rush. He did not posture. He moved through the mansion as if it were already familiar, pausing occasionally not to admire but to assess. When he spoke to others, it was briefly, economically, with an ease that suggested command without dependence. When he acknowledged Evelyn, it was with precision. Not warmth. Not hostility. Recognition. Their proximity was never framed as intentional, yet they were repeatedly placed within the same orbit. Shared spaces, overlapping schedules, moments where staff withdrew just enough to create silence without privacy. The arrangement felt deliberate without being overt. He never explained her presence in the house. He never explained his. Evelyn understood quickly that asking direct questions would yield nothing. This was not a man who responded to confrontation. He operated through implication, through the careful release of partial truths that forced others to reveal themselves. She began to see the logic. If he was responsible for the massacre, keeping her close allowed him to monitor risk. If he was not, then she was leverage, bait positioned near the center of power to draw out those who believed the Langford matter unfinished. Either way, her survival had value. Their connection formed without trust and without illusion. Every interaction carried the weight of mutual threat. He knew she was watching. She knew he was aware of it. Neither acknowledged the imbalance directly, but both respected its existence. The house amplified that tension. At night, Evelyn felt the cameras most acutely. The absence of noise made their presence oppressive. She slept lightly, aware that even vulnerability was recorded. The building absorbed her exhaustion and returned it as data. Yet the longer she remained, the more she learned. She noticed inconsistencies in the security logs, minor outages that did not align with maintenance schedules, footage gaps lasting seconds rather than minutes, occurring at irregular intervals. Not mistakes, but edits. Someone was curating the record. The deeper she observed, the clearer it became that the mansion was not merely a surveillance space. It was a filter. Information entered, but only what served a specific narrative was allowed to leave intact. The man at the center of the city understood this architecture perfectly. He did not need to threaten Evelyn. He simply allowed her to see enough to realize how little power she had left. And still, he kept her there. That contradiction became the axis around which her fear began to transform. If she were meant to disappear, she would not be housed so carefully. If she were meant to be silenced, she would not be positioned so visibly. The mansion was not a cage. It was a pressure chamber. As days passed, Evelyn stopped thinking in terms of innocence or guilt. Those categories belonged to a system that no longer applied. The man who held the city together was either the architect of her family's destruction or the only figure capable of exposing those who had engineered it. The difference mattered less than the outcome. She realized then that the house was testing her. Not overtly, not cruelly, but relentlessly. It measured her restraint, her patience, her ability to exist under constant observation without fracturing. Power in this city rewarded endurance more than truth. Evelyn did not break. She stayed. She watched. She learned the rhythm of cameras, the tempo of authority, the silences where decisions were made without words. And in doing so, she understood the most dangerous truth yet. The man who controlled the city had not decided what to do with her. Not yet. Which meant the story was still unfolding, and she was no longer just a witness to it. She was part of the design. The reports told a clean story. Too clean. Evelyn understood that before she ever touched a document. The official narrative of the Langford massacre had been polished quickly, compressed into a sequence of causes and conclusions that fit neatly into institutional logic. A targeted attack with unknown perpetrators. No confirmed political motive. No actionable leads beyond what had already been addressed. Assets frozen pending inheritance clarification. Case ongoing, but stable. Stable was the word that gave it away. Real chaos never stabilized this fast. The first cracks appeared in the financial summaries. Evelyn accessed them cautiously, never directly, always through layers of intermediaries and borrowed credentials. She avoided dramatic discoveries. Instead, she focused on margins, footnotes, archived annexes that no one expected a grieving survivor to read closely. That was where the truth hid. The Langfords had not been powerful because of visible wealth. Their real leverage existed in transitional spaces between industries, in contracts that bridged public infrastructure and private execution. Land holdings that sat precisely where zoning regulations were about to shift. Shell companies that appeared dormant until traced alongside military procurement schedules. Nothing illegal on the surface. Everything dangerous beneath it. She began mapping timelines. Land purchases coinciding with federal transport expansions. Trust transfers aligned with defense subcontracting cycles. Seemingly irrelevant mineral rights suddenly intersecting with logistics corridors used by private military firms operating overseas. The family had known. Not everything, but enough. They had possessed information that revealed how public authority outsourced violence while maintaining plausible deniability. How cities grew not through organic development, but through negotiated destruction and reconstruction. How political careers survived scandals by ensuring someone else absorbed the blast. None of that appeared in police reports. It never would. The replacement heir functioned as expected. Her role was administrative, not strategic. She signed documents prepared for her, authorized restructurings she did not fully understand, and appeared at press events to embody continuity. Her legitimacy was manufactured efficiently, supported by notarized records and endorsements from people who benefited from speed rather than accuracy. Evelyn was not meant to contest her. She was meant to disappear into irrelevance. Pressure arrived incrementally, not through threats but through procedural isolation. Access delayed, requests redirected, legal standing questioned. Her name appeared in internal communications flagged with qualifiers like unreliable, traumatized, potentially unstable. A pattern emerged. Discredit first, neutralize second. When that proved insufficient, escalation followed. Anonymous tips circulated suggesting Evelyn had withheld information during the investigation. Financial auditors requested explanations for transactions she had never authorized. A civil suit materialized, accusing her of attempting to interfere with estate proceedings. Each move was minor on its own, defensible in isolation. Together, they formed a cage. Evelyn responded not with defiance, but with adaptation. She stopped reacting emotionally. She learned the rhythms of American institutional power, the way systems absorbed resistance by converting it into paperwork. She stopped trying to expose the truth directly and began assembling leverage instead. She documented inconsistencies meticulously. She archived versions of files that were later amended without explanation. She noted names that appeared repeatedly across unrelated boards and committees. She tracked which investigations stalled and which accelerated, and who signed the final authorizations. The deeper she went, the clearer the architecture became. The Langfords had been inconvenient because they occupied a liminal position, too informed to be ignored, too independent to be controlled. Their assets were not the problem, their memory was. Someone had decided that erasure was more efficient than negotiation. The man who governed the city remained a constant presence, never intervening directly, never obstructing her movements outright. His involvement manifested in subtler ways. Files she should not have accessed remained inexplicably available. Certain inquiries that should have triggered alerts did not. It was as if a narrow corridor had been left open deliberately. She did not mistake this for kindness. He was observing how she moved through resistance, whether she understood the difference between truth and survivable truth, whether she could distinguish exposure from collapse. At night, Evelyn cross-referenced financial data with security logs from the night of the attack. That was where the reports failed completely. Surveillance disruptions aligned too neatly with moments when external contractors would have required access. Police response times deviated from historical averages in ways that suggested coordination rather than incompetence. These anomalies were not accidental. They had been excluded intentionally. The reports were not wrong. They were incomplete by design. Evelyn realized then that justice was not being obstructed. It was being redirected. The conspiracy did not depend on secrecy alone. It depended on exhaustion, on the assumption that no one would endure the process long enough to reconstruct what had been deliberately fragmented. She did endure. Every discovery carried risk. Each archived file created the possibility of retaliation. Yet the system hesitated to eliminate her outright. Too visible, too politically expensive. Better to let her continue, monitored and contained, until she reached a point where her findings could be reframed as obsession. She understood the game. And she continued anyway. By the end of this phase, Evelyn no longer thought in terms of revenge. The scale of what she uncovered made personal retribution irrelevant. This was about exposure calibrated carefully enough to detonate upward rather than inward. She was not gathering evidence to punish one man. She was preparing to force a system to acknowledge itself. And everything she now knew was precisely what had never made it into the reports. The restoration of Evelyn Langford's name did not arrive with relief. It arrived as a switch being flipped inside a machine that had been quietly idling, waiting for a signal. The ruling itself was unromantic, a clean procedural correction wrapped in formal language, a set of entries amended across databases that never slept. There was no courtroom spectacle, no triumphant walk down marble stairs, no moment of public vindication that felt like a new beginning. A name was returned the way a property deed was reissued after a clerical error, as if identity were a document misfiled rather than a life that had been forcibly rewritten. Yet the consequences were immediate, because in the city where Evelyn lived, nothing mattered until it was visible to systems that could monetize it, weaponize it, or suppress it. Her name reappeared where it had been erased, on registries tied to estates, in digital archives maintained by law firms that served families with old money and newer power, in insurance files that had already been settled with unusual speed, in land records that connected to suburban tracts and industrial parcels that had shifted hands in the weeks after the Langfords' house burned, in the donor history of a foundation that still bore the family's shadow, even after the family itself had been cut away. And as soon as the name returned, the city's attention reorganized itself around it. Before, Evelyn had been a survivor without leverage, the kind of person institutions could pity in private and dismiss in public. A young woman with no documents that counted, no allies willing to be seen, no narrative strong enough to compete with the one that had been installed in her place. She had existed in a narrow corridor of tolerated existence, watched more than helped. People had allowed her to breathe because killing her outright would have been messy, because an obvious second death invited the kind of questions even powerful men preferred not to answer. Now she was no longer a shadow. She became a node. A reinstated identity was not simply a personal victory. It was a legal event. It triggered obligations and liabilities. It forced certain parties to revisit signatures. It introduced the possibility of audits and disputes. It risked reopening closed files, not only the ones written by police, but the private files maintained by the city's most reliable operators: compliance officers, corporate counsel, political strategists, security consultants who did not wear badges. The same people who had avoided her eyes now looked for her face. Visibility was the new threat. Her restored name meant that if she disappeared, there would be a record that someone had been present and then removed. It meant that if she spoke, the press could not dismiss her as an imposter without challenging a court-recognized identity. It meant that her death would not be a footnote attached to the tragedy of her family, but a second incident with an obvious pattern, and patterns were what investigators and journalists hunted. The city did not love Evelyn, but it feared what her existence could force into the open. The first change came in the form of attention, dressed as civility. Calls arrived from numbers that hid behind receptionist buffers. Letters came on thick stationery with the texture of old money and the smell of careful distance. Invitations landed in her mailbox and in her inbox, framed as gestures of support, as opportunities, as necessary meetings to discuss the transition. Some offers were generous enough to feel unreal. Accommodations in a secure residence, legal teams that promised relentless advocacy, transportation provided by private security firms with impeccable reputations. They all carried the same unspoken condition. Proximity would be exchanged for control. Evelyn recognized this instinctively. She had been raised around people who understood hierarchy, even if she had been kept away from the more explicit machinery of it. She knew the difference between help and capture. She read tone the way others read headlines. She listened for the purpose behind each word, the shape of the request beneath the politeness. She accepted very little. She did not reject everything outright, because refusing all contact would paint her as unstable, uncooperative, or irrational. The city loved labeling inconvenient women with any word that made them easier to contain. Evelyn instead chose the middle path that the system had taught her to respect. She met people on terms that kept her mobile. She let them speak. She asked neutral questions. She learned who flinched at which names. Every meeting became an interrogation in reverse. The pressure escalated when the governor's office stopped pretending distance. Until then, the governor had been present in her life as a gravitational force rather than a constant companion. His influence had been felt in doors that opened and doors that stayed closed. In the way certain police questions softened, in the way certain legal obstacles cleared, in the way a few individuals treated her with a caution that had nothing to do with compassion and everything to do with fear of being on the wrong side of him. With her name restored, he stepped closer. Not like a man seeking her forgiveness, Not like a hero stepping into light, more like a strategist moving a critical piece from the board's edge to its center, because the game had shifted and leaving her unattended now posed a higher risk than keeping her near. His methods changed with his proximity. Fewer intermediaries, less ambiguity, more direct control over the environment around her. Security tightened in ways that were described as protection, but felt like surveillance. Routes were recommended with the firmness of orders. Meetings she requested were screened by people she had never hired. The governor's staff began to appear around her life as if they had always belonged there. The city interpreted this quickly. Rumors moved faster than facts. They threaded through gala tables and charity boards, through courthouse hallways and gym locker rooms, through the quiet spaces where influential people relaxed enough to speak honestly. A new narrative began to form. Evelyn Langford was under the governor's shield. Some said she was being protected because she was a witness. Others said she was being protected because she was a bargaining chip. A few, more vulgar and more confident in their cruelty, suggested she was being kept for personal reasons. Evelyn did not correct any of it. She understood the value of confusion. If people could not agree on why she was close to him, they would hesitate to strike, unsure which retaliation they would invite. Ambiguity in this world was armor. But armor came with weight. The governor's involvement also meant she was now attached to his enemies. Every faction that hated him or wanted him weakened would see her as an entry point. Every faction that relied on him would see her as a liability. Every faction that worked alongside him would watch her for signs of betrayal, the way predators watched prey for the stumble that made the kill cheap. Her restored name made her public. Her association with him made her political. The next stage of pressure came as a coordinated attempt to define her before she could define herself. Not through obvious threats, through narrative management. Articles appeared online that read like sympathetic profiles, but carried a subtle undertone of fragility. They emphasized her trauma, her isolation, her confusion. Commentators described her as a grieving daughter struggling to reconcile loss with reality. Anonymous sources, always anonymous, suggested she had become obsessive, unstable, unable to accept that tragedies sometimes had no villains. It was not meant to convince everyone. It was meant to plant doubt where it would matter later. In jurors' minds, in judges' patience, in the willingness of law enforcement agencies to allocate resources, in the appetite of journalists to take risks on her claims. Evelyn recognized the tactic because it was old. The city was modern, but its instincts were ancient. If they could not erase her, they would diminish her. If they could not disprove her, they would make her seem unreliable. She did not respond emotionally. She responded structurally. She began building a parallel credibility network, quietly, methodically. Not a dramatic appeal to public sympathy, but a series of small moves designed to make it harder to dismiss her later. She gathered official letters confirming the identity ruling. She documented every attempt to contact her, every offer, every implied threat. She recorded patterns, who called when, after which filings. She kept copies of every public mention of her name, every article framing her as unstable, every online post that smelled of coordinated messaging. She treated the narrative war like evidence. The city, meanwhile, divided around her in a way that looked like concern, but functioned like sorting. There were those who wanted to use her. They viewed her as a symbol, a reinstated heir who could legitimize transactions, calm investors, reassure the public that order had been restored. These people spoke warmly, offered support, suggested she could become the public face of a new Langford legacy, one cleansed of the scandalous whispering that had surrounded her family's closed-door dealings. Evelyn understood their goal immediately. They did not want truth. They wanted continuity. Then there were those who wanted to destroy her, not because they hated her personally, but because her existence threatened a chain of decisions that were already in motion. She could reopen disputes over land. She could contest the redistribution of assets. She could force audits into contracts that had been awarded with a speed that suggested pre-planning. She could draw attention to the family's financial documents, which had not merely recorded wealth but tracked relationships, payments, obligations, favors owed and collected. And then there were those who wanted to control her without harming her, which was the most dangerous group of all. They believed they could contain her anger, redirect her curiosity, and turn her into a manageable component of the system. They spoke to her about healing, about moving forward, about focusing on honoring her family rather than digging into details that would only wound her further. They offered her something that looked like peace. Evelyn saw the trap. Peace was the reward offered to people who stopped asking questions. She did not stop. The further she dug, the more she felt the city tightening, not around her physically, but around information itself. Financial documents that should have been accessible began to require additional approvals. Requests were delayed. Clerks became apologetic, then evasive. Certain records that had once been visible through standard public channels now appeared redacted or reclassified. People she approached for confirmation suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts that lasted indefinitely. Her world narrowed. And yet, within that narrowing, she began to see the structure more clearly. The Langfords had not merely been wealthy. They had been connected to a set of transactions that straddled public infrastructure and private military contracting. They had owned land parcels that mattered not for development, but for access. Proximity to shipping routes, adjacency to storage facilities, rights over certain industrial corridors that could be turned into pipelines for equipment. They had held information tied to bidding processes, subcontractor relationships, and off-the-books arrangements that blurred the line between municipal governance and corporate warfare. Her family's death had not been random violence. It had been removal. The replacement heir, the woman who had presented herself as the only surviving Langford, began to vanish from the public eye as Evelyn's name regained legitimacy. At first, it looked like a retreat out of fear. Then it looked like extraction, a plan reaching its final phase. The woman's role had been to occupy the identity long enough for assets to shift smoothly. Now that Evelyn's name had returned, keeping the imposter visible only increased risk. Evelyn watched the disappearance without satisfaction. She suspected the woman had never been truly in control. She had been used, and then discarded. Discarding, in this city, did not always mean letting someone live. That realization increased Evelyn's urgency. She understood that if the machine was willing to burn an entire family, it would not hesitate to erase a pawn. If the imposter was eliminated quietly, the city would call it tragic, unfortunate, unrelated. Evelyn did not know whether saving her was possible. She only knew that the woman's removal confirmed one essential fact. A plan existed beyond her. The governor, during this period, revealed more of himself, not through confession, but through constraint. He began speaking to Evelyn less like an official offering protection and more like a man managing a crisis that threatened to detonate under his feet. His interventions became sharper. He discouraged certain lines of inquiry with a firmness that made it clear he was not simply worried for her safety. He was worried for his own survival. Evelyn did not require him to admit guilt. She required him to admit involvement. And involvement was obvious. He was too informed about what she found, too quick to anticipate where records would be blocked, too calm about certain obstacles, too tense about others. He did not react like an outsider learning disturbing truths. He reacted like someone recognizing the contours of a battlefield he had already been fighting on, quietly, for years. Their relationship reached a new stage, mutual threat recognition. He could not easily eliminate her. She could not easily trust him. But they were connected now, not by affection or loyalty, but by danger. If she exposed the network fully, she would pull him down with it unless he moved first to protect himself. If he moved first to protect himself, he might sacrifice her. They circled each other with an awareness that both of them were holding weapons, even if those weapons looked like documents and influence rather than guns. Evelyn adapted by building redundancy. She began storing evidence in multiple places, copies of files in secure digital vaults, physical documents hidden in locations that did not connect to her daily routine. She created time-stamped records of discoveries and sent them to people who could not easily be pressured into silence. Independent investigators, journalists with reputations for stubbornness, legal advocates outside the city's immediate influence. She did not give anyone everything at once. She distributed fragments. Fragments were harder to suppress because no single person held the whole truth, and therefore no single act of intimidation could erase it. If she died, the fragments could still assemble themselves in someone else's hands. It was not paranoia. It was survival strategy. The city responded in its own way. She began noticing minor anomalies that made her skin tighten. Cars that appeared too often behind her on quiet streets. Strangers in cafes who watched without pretending not to. Unexplained delays in her bank access. A sudden system review that froze a small account she used for daily expenses. A polite call from a compliance officer suggesting she was now high profile, and therefore certain transactions would be monitored more closely. It was pressure without fingerprints. It was a reminder that everything she touched could be slowed, complicated, questioned. Then came the moment that should have felt like triumph, and instead felt like the opening of a trap. Her name was restored in a public-facing way. A corrected headline, a formal acknowledgement in the local press, an official notice that her legal status as heir had been recognized. The story was framed as a bureaucratic correction, not a scandal. The city treated it as an administrative closure rather than a reopening. Evelyn read the words and felt nothing like closure. Because now everyone knew. And now everyone had permission to act. The next week brought an increase in direct contact. People who had not spoken to her in years reached out with sudden warmth. Old acquaintances offered condolences too late to be genuine. Business figures asked for meetings to support her transition. Politically connected families invited her to private events under the guise of community solidarity. Each invitation was a probe. Each meeting was a test. Evelyn attended just enough to remain present, to avoid being framed as unstable or hostile. She refused to be hidden. She dressed with restraint, spoke with care, and revealed very little. She watched the micro-reactions, the tightness around mouths when certain topics surfaced. She tracked who mentioned land, who mentioned security, who mentioned the governor with too much reverence or too much bitterness. The governor's posture hardened during these events. He appeared beside her sometimes not as a partner but as a reminder to others. She was under his attention, and attention was not the same as protection, but it carried consequence. People adjusted their tone when he entered a room. Smiles tightened. Conversations became more careful. Evelyn began to understand something unsettling. His presence protected her not because he wanted her safe, but because he wanted her contained. Containment was his form of control. If he could keep her close, he could monitor what she knew, what she planned to release, and to whom. He could also discourage others from acting rashly, preventing them from starting a chain reaction he might not be able to stop. He was not her savior. He was managing an explosion. And she was a fuse. This realization did not break her. It clarified her. Evelyn stopped hopping for allies in the traditional sense. She accepted that everyone around her had an angle, including the man who looked most capable of defending her. She began measuring people not by declared loyalty, but by predictable self-interest. Predictability in her situation was safer than trust. She took careful note of those who wanted to use her publicly. Their offers could be redirected. Their need for legitimacy could become leverage if handled correctly. She also noted those who wanted her gone. They were more dangerous, but also easier to anticipate. They would move through rumor, through legal harassment, through attempts to provoke mistakes. The most dangerous were still those who wanted to control her gently. They would try to persuade her to surrender without realizing it. Evelyn refused. She continued gathering what she needed to complete her understanding of the conspiracy. She traced the movement of assets not as greed, but as logistics. She followed the timeline of contracts that had been amended days before the massacre, as if someone had prepared for the Langfords' removal. She noticed a pattern of emergency approvals signed under the justification of public safety. She watched the way certain private security firms gained municipal contracts immediately after the incident, replacing the Langfords' old protective arrangements. It looked like opportunism, but it moved with the precision of scheduling. Her family had been removed, and within days, the city's security apparatus had shifted. The kind of shift that suggested planning. The truth, in this chapter, became heavier rather than more dramatic. Evelyn understood that her restored name did not return her life. It returned her to a battlefield. Every action she took now had an audience. Every silence she kept would be interpreted. Every mistake could be framed as proof she was unstable. Every correct move would provoke retaliation. Her victory was real, and more dangerous than her defeat. The chapter ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with Evelyn standing inside that new reality with an unshakable understanding. She had stepped out of invisibility, and she could never return to it. The city now had to account for her, and accounting would not be gentle. She had reclaimed her name. And the price of that name was not admiration, or security, or justice delivered cleanly. The price was escalation. The people who benefited from the Langfords' silence had already proven they could erase a family. Evelyn's restored identity meant they would either erase her too or force her into a version of survival that required obedience. She chose the only option that did not turn her into another controlled absence. She chose to keep moving forward, even knowing that every step would sharpen the danger, because retreat would not save her. Retreat would only give the system what it wanted, a restored name with a quiet, compliant woman attached to it. Evelyn did not become compliant. She became inevitable. The city resumed its rhythm with remarkable discipline. Within weeks of the investigation entering the public sphere, traffic patterns normalized, construction permits were approved, charity galas returned to their seasonal calendars, and headlines shifted their attention to safer crises. The Langford name appeared occasionally, referenced in articles that framed the events as resolved complications rather than systemic rupture. A tragedy acknowledged, processed, and filed away. The city demonstrated what it had always done best, absorbing shock without changing direction. Evelyn watched this with a clarity that no longer surprised her. The disclosures had landed exactly as expected. Carefully released documents, corroborated financial trails, and verifiable procedural failures had forced responses from institutions that preferred silence. Several figures fell publicly. A contractor resigned citing personal reasons. A senior official accepted responsibility for oversight failures and retired early. A private security firm lost a lucrative municipal contract and rebranded within months. Each consequence appeared significant in isolation. Together, they formed a narrative of accountability. And that narrative was incomplete. The deeper structures remained untouched. Those who had designed the pathways rather than signed the documents stayed invisible, protected by layers of legality and distance. Responsibility was redistributed downward and sideways, never upward. The system offered sacrifices that did not threaten its core. Evelyn understood the pattern intimately by now. Justice in this city did not arrive as correction. It arrived as calibration. The investigations concluded with language that emphasized reform, transparency, and lessons learned. Committees were formed. Policies were reviewed. Recommendations were published and archived. The machinery of governance moved efficiently from exposure to insulation. The city did not deny what happened. It contextualized it until meaning dissolved. Public opinion followed predictable arcs. Outrage peaked and softened. Interest declined. The details became too complex for sustained attention, too procedural to sustain emotion. The story lost its villains and therefore its urgency. Without a single face to blame, the narrative fragmented and faded. Evelyn felt no impulse to resist this fatting. She had not entered the conflict expecting vindication. She had entered it to survive and to understand. What she gained instead was position. Her name, fully restored, carried operational weight. Assets previously frozen were released under oversight. Legal authority returned to her in ways that mattered less for wealth than for access. She gained the ability to attend meetings she had once been excluded from, to request information without immediate dismissal, to be present where decisions were made rather than where consequences were explained. Influence arrived quietly. Not through applause or recognition, but through inclusion. She now sat in rooms where conversations paused when she entered, where people recalibrated what they said and how quickly they said it, where her silence carried interpretive weight. She learned that in this city, being heard was less important than being anticipated. The governor remained in office. His survival had been calculated carefully, his distance from direct culpability preserved through timing and technicality. He acknowledged failures without admitting intent. He allowed reforms that did not threaten foundational arrangements. He appeared cooperative without conceding control. Evelyn did not mistake this for victory or defeat. It was coexistence. Their relationship settled into a functional equilibrium. Neither trusted the other. Neither needed to. They understood the limits of exposure, the costs of escalation, the risks of sudden moves. The danger between them stabilized into something colder and more durable. Mutual awareness replaced confrontation. The city preferred the state. Evelyn noticed how quickly people adjusted to her new role. Those who had once spoken to her with patronizing concern now addressed her with professional caution. Those who had avoided her entirely now acknowledged her presence with polite neutrality. She was no longer an anomaly. She was integrated. Integration, she realized, was the city's final act of control. It allowed her to exist without allowing her to disrupt. The Langford properties that mattered most were no longer residences. They were parcels of land, rights of way, strategic holdings whose value lay in their position rather than their sentiment. Evelyn did not sell them. She did not rush to develop them. She held them deliberately, understanding that patience itself was leverage. Waiting, she had learned, was not passivity. It was preparation. The memory of her family did not return as comfort. It returned as clarity. She no longer romanticized what had been lost. She understood now that the Langfords had survived as long as they did not because they were virtuous, but because they were useful. When usefulness expired, removal followed. The city did not hate them. It outgrew them. That understanding stripped away the last illusion Evelyn had carried. There was no moral arc bending toward justice here. There was only balance maintained through negotiation, sacrifice, and silence. And silence could be strategic. She chose carefully what to pursue next. Some threads she let go, recognizing that pulling them would cause collapse without resolution. Others she preserved, documenting and storing without immediate intent to release. Information, she learned, did not always need to be used to remain powerful. Sometimes it only needed to exist. The city's attempt to normalize the past did not erase her vigilance. It refined it. She watched policy changes closely, noting which reforms stalled and which advanced. She observed who benefited from new regulations and who quietly adapted. She paid attention to how fear relocated rather than disappeared. The system did not heal. It redistributed pressure. Evelyn's presence altered calculations even when she said nothing. Deals were structured more carefully. Language became more cautious. Contingencies multiplied. The city did not trust her fully, and that mistrust functioned as restraint. She accepted that role without pride. This was not the ending she would have imagined if she still believed in resolution. There was no courtroom revelation that restored moral order. No reckoning that balanced loss with justice. No moment when grief transformed cleanly into peace. There was only position. And the knowledge that she would not be erased again. The city continued to behave as if nothing fundamental had changed. Streets filled. Buildings rose. Contracts were signed. People moved forward with lives unburdened by questions they did not need to ask. Evelyn understood that this was not denial. It was design. Cities survived by pretending continuity where fracture existed. They taught their inhabitants how to forget selectively, how to accept incomplete truths, how to trade certainty for comfort. She did not attempt to correct this behavior. She adapted to it. By the end, Evelyn no longer thought of herself as a victim or a victor. Those categories belonged to simpler stories. She had become something less visible and more enduring, a participant who understood the rules well enough to anticipate their abuse. Her family did not return. Justice remained partial. But Evelyn was no longer acted upon without consequence. She had learned how power moved when no one was watching, how fear disguised itself as procedure, how accountability was negotiated rather than delivered. She had learned that survival in this city required calculation, patience, and the willingness to live without illusions. The city made peace with itself. Evelyn did not. She simply stopped expecting it to. And that was the cold victory that remained. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.